this is the Provoked Prawn, and this is a review of the Phanteks XT Pro Ultra, which is an affordable case with some really nice highlights to it that you can see I built here with a rear connect motherboard and a rear connect GPU, as well as a 360mm all-in-one cooler and some additional Phanteks fans. In this video though, I'm going to talk to you about my experiences with the case and what it's like to build in, some of the highlights and lowlights, as well as showing you performance metrics and tests later on in the video, including benchmarks and testing in that way, and then also gaming experience, talk about the fan levels and noise, as well as just the overall temps and more. And I'll leave the specs of the build in the description, but I'll also leave a link to the full build guide. So if you want to set up the case in a similar way to me, you can follow the step-by-step in-depth build on the case and see all the steps for it. First of all, though, I'm going to break down the case and show you the various different things of interest. As you can see, stripped down, it comes with 4 RGB fans, which is actually pretty awesome for the amount of money you're going to be paying for this case. And there's very nice highlights in that, so you get that many fans included. Also, it will work with standard ATX motherboards as well as rear connect motherboards, so it's important to highlight that. So you can see here an ASRock live mixer motherboard, for example, which has a standard connections on the front. Now, one of the things to note immediately here is you'll see there's a lot of gaps around the edge, allowing you to run the cables through, and this can be good or bad. You can see here, for example, with the power cables plugged in and other things, there's obviously a lot of excess cable visible there. Not quite as nice looking. Now, some management will be required at the rear. Obviously, I haven't done that here because that's not the intention for the full build, but I thought it would be worth plugging in some of the cables so you could at least get an idea of roughly what it might look like or where the cables might run from. And you can see it's not quite as neat as we're going to end up with later on. So I think rear connect will probably make it look a lot nicer. So you can see it here with an Asus TUF Gaming motherboard where all the connections are on the rear. I would recommend this setup because it looks a lot cleaner in here, although obviously you might not like the white motherboard in a black case. Depends whether you like that contrast or not. I think it personally looks pretty good, but I know some people aren't a fan of it. But as you can see, when that's set up, there's no cables visible. It's a lot cleaner looking. And then when you use a GPU like this rear connect GPU where the power connector plugs into the motherboard instead of having to worry about power cables running through to the front, you can also end up with a really clean design there. If you're using a standard graphics card, you can actually run power cables through where the fans are set at the bottom there. There's a little hole which allows you to run them through, but if you're installing fans like I am, then you can't use that, so it's worth noting. You can see that you can also pull off the top dust shielding here, which is held in place with a magnet, so you can easily get that off and clean it up. But I will note that some of the other panels are a little bit trickier. The glass side door panel, for example, I found a little bit fiddly to get off, and the same for the rear panel. Getting those on and off is a little bit difficult. The thumb screws are a little bit cheap feeling, and also the way it slides out isn't so easy, but you won't be doing that regularly, so it's not a major issue. It was just a bit of an annoyance during the build. The front panel, however, also does tug away nice and easily, so you can see you can pull that off and then you can access the front fans, and this has some dust shielding to it, but there's not one separate that you can take away from there, so you have to pull that whole thing off and then clean it up for future when it gets dirty. But again, you can see trying to get the rear panel off, the thumb screw's a little bit fiddly, and then I just had trouble with it. Even when they're unscrewed all the way, it requires quite a bit of aggressive tugging. I actually sped that clip up. There's a lot more time messing about with that, and I found that when I was taking it off and put it back on again, it was a bit problematic. There are some notches along there which basically shut it in place into the case, but it was just a little bit fiddly. I think it's worth noting. Hopefully you won't have as many issues, but it just felt like the doors on the sides are a little bit cheap feeling and a little bit not very easy to install, especially from other cases I've tested lately by comparison. However, it is a cheap case, so keeping that in mind, it's not too much of a problem, and you're not going to be doing it regularly, so not a major issue. At the back, you can see some space for the cabling, and actually the pre-installed cables are pretty well managed, but we'll get to management in a minute. At the bottom, there's also a dust filter for the power supply unit to stop ingress of dirt there. You can easily tug that out and access it, but it does pull out from the rear, which might not be easy to access depending on your build. Accessories box includes a lot of the plastic cable ties, which you will need to tidy things up. And then for the installation of the power supply and cable management, I want to talk about that because it is important. Because as you'll see, it's quite narrow at the back. there's not a great deal of space back here. Once we get to managing the power cables, which obviously we're plugging in at the rear with this rear connect motherboard, then there are some loops in the case at various different points here. Now, I did feel like I had to make quite aggressive use of these, and it will be worth doing. With a rear connect motherboard, you do anyway, because you want to make sure your cables are out of the way of the various ports for plugging other cables in. But here, we need to make sure they're tied down well, simply so we can shut the back door nice and easily, because there's not much room here at all. You can see that I've tied cables to themselves to neaten them up. I've also tied cables to the loops via there. I've also tied on the left-hand side the standard front panel connectors, so for the power switch, HD audio, and for the USB-C and USB-A connectors here. You can see that I've tied them up and I'm trying to run them in a way where they won't be visible from the front. The idea here is to create a build which is really neat, so I want to make sure these are hidden, but there's not very much in the way of areas that you can tie on the left-hand side, sadly. So I ended up having to tie cables to themselves or to other cables in order to sort of hold those in place. And once you get to a really thick cable like the 24-pin power connector, you're going to need to make sure that's tied down well. Now, I'm harping on about this point a bit too much, perhaps, but I wanted to make sure that you're aware if you're doing this with a rear connect, you need to get those cables out of the way for that rear door. Now, the case comes with 4 RGB fans, as I mentioned. I'm using these additional M25-120 fans, which I've done a separate wiring guide on. I want to quickly show these because the logic for them is basically the same as what's already in the case. You've got 3 fans on the front, for example, that are connected together. These fans daisy chain both their power and RGB connectors. One fan connects to one fan and then to the next fan, and the connectors are really simple and straightforward, especially if you follow my guide, and basically plugging these all in makes life pretty easy. But they're already connected for you in the case of the front fans and the rear fans, so you just need to run the cables to the motherboard, which would be your 5-volt RGB connector and then a chassis fan connector or system fan connector for the power. So you've got power and RGB powered from the motherboard. But because the case fans are already set up like this, makes it really straightforward. And then when you're throwing in additional fans like I am, again, you're not using much here. And I didn't end up having to use a fan controller. Although the cables might look a bit messy, you're ending up with only just a few connections, even with all these additional fans plugged in and set up in the case. Talking of installing fans, obviously I'm putting fans on the bottom of the case here, which you can see you need the long screws for. So they include these long radiator-like screws in the accessories box, which you use to install the fans. I'm putting them on the bottom tray here as intake fans, which means the blades face downwards and you have to unfortunately see the back of the fans. But what this does mean is that you're pulling cold air and blowing it onto the GPU. Now, obviously, you'll note that one of the fans on the left-hand side is sitting above the power supply unit, as you can see from a couple of different angles, which might not be ideal, but the other one should get a good bit of draw of air through there. And I think there's enough of a gap. You'll see the performance testing of it later on. As you can see, you can also top mount a 360mm all-in-one cooler, although it was a little bit fiddly to get in. But the daisy chaining of the RGB power cables and more at the rear is pretty straightforward. That radiator, I've put some additional M25 fans on, and then you end up with just a bunch of daisy chained together RGB connectors that you just plug into a 5-volt RGB header on your motherboard, and then you can control all the lighting for everything from your motherboard software or from something like Signal RGB, for example. And then you'll end up, in this instance, I've got a Montech cooler with an RGB pump, and then we've got RGB Phanteks fans throughout, so we have some very nice RGB lighting, and Corsair's RGB RAM as well. At the rear, there is this removable panel here, which you can see you can take off, and then you can access the back of the motherboard if you want to for installing the backplate for your cooler. But you can also mount up to 3 SSDs on it. This is nicely designed and pretty straightforward. It has a thumb screw at the bottom, makes it easy to take out. You can see there's a couple of hooks at the top that notch it into the case, and the installation just requires some small screws, and then you can put in multiple drives. I only have 2 to be able to demonstrate this, but you can see there's space for a third one, so you could put 3 in there really easily. And then because of the way the cables work, you can run and plug those in pretty straightforward as well. And there's not too much hassle here. I said there was problems with the other cables, but with these ones it was pretty straightforward, especially with the rear connect motherboard. If you want to use a hard disk drive, there's also a caddy which sits at the bottom of the case, and you have the option to mount an additional SSD on there as well. So you could potentially put another one in there. So there's actually plenty of space in this system for mounting several storage drives in different places, which makes it pretty straightforward. This caddy has the advantage, obviously, for a hard disk drive mounting, that you can also put it towards the front of the case and then have the front intake fan basically blowing onto it. Also, you'll see that despite all the cables down there, there's actually still plenty of room. This is an 850 watt power supply unit in a build with obviously a lot of devices and a lot of cables, and yet still there's plenty of space down there. So I didn't feel like there wasn't much room at the bottom of the case, at least, for the managing of things and setting things up, and storage is really straightforward. The rear door, however, was still a trouble to get on, and it wasn't because of the cable management. The cables were fine, but as you can see, it's just a little bit difficult to slide into place and to hook in there. Let me know in the comments if you have the same issue, if you do get it, because I'm curious whether it's just my incompetence or not, but that was my thought process on it. But at the end of it, we end up with a really nice looking build. Very clean setup. Runs pretty quietly, as I'll show you in a second, and not too bad. You know, the GPU doesn't have an anti-sag bracket built into the case, but there is room if you look at the rear here where I've put a GPU anti-sag bracket in just behind that fan there. From the front, you can see the hard disk drive and the power supply unit, but obviously once the glass panel's on, you don't have that same view. And the RGB lighting as standard is also really nice and easy to control with the motherboard. And then you can just pop the panels back on and end up with a nice clean setup there. Now, as you've seen from this, I've actually been pretty impressed with what you get for your money. So it's a pretty good value for money case in terms of having 4 easy to connect up fans and plenty of room for other things, plenty of storage space for your drives, for example, and just a nice finish on it. The overall vibe that I'm getting from this is a pretty good build, and I'm pretty happy with how it's turned out. Let me know what you think, especially with a rear connect motherboard. So it has support for rear connect, and this is one of the better cases that I've seen. I've seen some other cases which support rear connect but don't do it in a great way. This one does it really well, but obviously you also can use a standard motherboard if you prefer, and you don't want to use a rear connect. That's not an issue either. And then you end up with a nice setup. So let's get into some of the thermal testing. Now, I put it through a number of different benchmarks and aggressive tests here. So we're using Cinebench first of all to see how we got on. Now, obviously, your experience may vary depending on what you're using. I'm using an i9-14900K in this setup here, and you can see overall it was thermal throttling, and you can see the core temperatures maxed out at 90, but most of the cores weren't that hot. So we're looking at the mid-80s on the P cores, for example. So not too bad, and considering it's an i9 and with the problems the 14th gen's been having, it's not been too much of an issue. Motherboard temperatures were also good, and the fans weren't getting too loud. Now, I ran it through Intel's Extreme Tuning Utility because there's a stress test you can do in there for quite some time as well, and I wanted to put it through another load. You can see we're power throttling and current throttling, but we actually don't have too much in the way of temperature problems here. You can see a maximum 86 degrees on this, and there's also no thermal throttling this time, so it's actually running quite well in that extreme testing utility. And then I ran with 3D Mark as well with the Port Royal test because I want to see how it gets on with GPU and CPU temperatures combined. And you can see here we're looking at about 60 degrees, just over 60 degrees on the GPU and 50 degrees on the CPU. And then I ran it through gaming. Now I'm playing Escape from Tarkov, which isn't particularly well optimized or hard on either the CPU or the GPU. But with other games, I also found a similar sort of experience in that it wasn't getting too toasty and it also wasn't getting too loud. And I'll let you hear what it sounds like in a second without me talking over the top. But you can see the temperature readouts at the top here in the top right corner. We're looking at about 43 degrees on the GPU, which is actually pretty good. Now, I was surprised by this because those bottom fans obviously don't have direct access to venting at the bottom necessarily. One's blocked by the power supply unit, for example, as I said, and they're not directly pulling air from below the case that easily. But despite this, we're still running nice and cool when playing on max settings and recording as well. So pretty impressive and not too terrible there. And now I'll let you listen to what the PC sounds like without me talking while playing, so you can get an idea of the sound levels of the fans but I didn't find them to be obnoxious, which is definitely a benefit. Overall, a really good case. Check out the full build guide linked in the description to see more on it. Thanks for watching.
You've made it right to the end of the video, you brilliant legend you. If you've enjoyed it, click that subscribe button, give me a thumbs up, and drop me a comment down below if you've got any questions. If you really enjoyed it, consider joining the channel and see the benefits of doing so. Check out these other videos, you might well find them interesting or useful, and most importantly, have a great life.